but you know what? It's like a warm-up act before the US turns its sights on China.
Yeah,
So
100%. And that's so important. That's such a good point. And of course, walking around Moscow now or any of the big cities, you see all these Chinese cars, these great Chinese cars, like that are basically replacing all the European brands, the Opels or the Fiat or the Ford, the
right.
American brands. They just don't exist anymore, but they're all Haval and Cherry and all these really slick looking Chinese cars. So this sort of vacuum that's been created by a very foolish collective self-harm in the West to cut off their companies from vast Russian markets. Remember, Russia's not a country in the sense of the United States. Russia is a continent. It's the biggest landmass on Earth. It has like 12 time zones, 170 languages. It has a vast, unrivaled, and you can't compete against Russia's access to natural resources. It simply doesn't exist. And, Russia is still a developing culture, I suppose, because of the invasion of Russia from Genghis Khan to Napoleon to Adolf Hitler, So Russia has been set back by these perpetual wars that have been fought against it. And that colors a lot of Russia's view of NATO and the West as well, which is something we could talk about maybe later. But what Russia now knows and understands is, we were Russia, ordinary people say, well, everything was meant to collapse. But the worst thing that happened is Starbucks coffee is now called Stars coffee, and it's owned by a Russian. Or that McDonald's is now called Vkusna i Tochka, which means tasty, and that's it. But it's McDonald's, right?
And I wanted to kind of look at that for a second. So, because the narrative was the sanctions were being used as, a very oppressive. Well, first they said it was a diplomatic tool, but it's not a diplomatic tool. It's, in my opinion, in some cases, it's a war crime. Like it's keeping people from getting goods and services that they need, not the elites in a country, but the working people. So the working people are harmed. And in countries that get sanctions, or like the Cuba being an example of the embargo, like how but they've still risen above it. They have the highest literacy rate in the world, and they've still moved on. Russia, what I've seen, which I really find is amazing, I wanted to ask you about this if you've noticed this in your time here. They seem to be taking it as a challenge and doing more manufacturing within and more creating their own products. Like you just mentioned, replacing, those star brands like Stars with the coffee and the McDonald's, but they're doing more than that. They're manufacturing their own thing. Do you find that expanding to different, different things, like even technology, or is it, do you think, mainly in agriculture?
Absolutely. And I mean, because of the work I do, I get to go to these conferences, the big Islamic business conference in Kazan, where Kazan is it's the capital of Islamic Russia, if you like. It's Tatarstan, and this vast arena that we go to these meetings for a Westerner to go and go, Jesus, how does this stuff exist? This huge oil-rich republic, Russian republic, ex-Soviet republic, but now part of the Russian Federation, where, you've got an Islamic republic. Imagine an Islamic republic in the United States. Imagine Texas or Nebraska was an Islamic republic. How impossible that sounds. But in Russia, no problem. Last week, Vladimir Putin turned up in, I think in Tashkent,
in
Derbent, while they're burning the Quran in Sweden and saying this is an expression of freedom of speech. And it's, it's obviously a hateful idea to stimulate, fractious sort of anger among the population. Vladimir Putin was saying, we respect the Quran. Burning the Quran in Russia is a crime, and we won't allow people to do it. He's a devout Christian. But, when I was in Kazan, one thing I noticed in the Kremlin, Kremlin means fortress, and many Russian cities will have a Kremlin, the biggest one being, of course, in Moscow. But in the Kremlin in Kazan, there's a huge mosque built in the center of the Kremlin. And right beside it, there's a Russian Orthodox church. And there's absolutely zero anger or competition between Orthodox Christianity and Islam, or no religion. You don't need to have a religion in Russia. Nobody really cares what you want to do in Russia. I suppose that's the difference between us and in the Western world. Something I've learned. It's like the whole LGBT thing of Pride Month, you know. Back home in Ireland, if you don't participate in Pride Month, that's a bad thing. You know, you become, you know, ostracized. You know, I'm not really into Pride Month. It's not my thing. I'm not gay. I don't really.
Yeah.
You're become a victim of this mobilized, centralized narrative. In Russia, nobody cares what you do behind the door of your apartment. Nobody cares who you're sleeping with, what your sexuality is. Nobody cares. And that's absolute. Nobody cares what you do. But you don't get to go out onto the street and then impose your view onto anybody else, because the state decides how that game is played. And some people have a big problem with that, but I don't have a big problem with that. I don't have a problem with being able to walk onto the metro in Moscow and go across one of the biggest cities in Europe, 22 million people living there, without fear of being accosted, harassed by a drug addict, by a criminal. It cost me a ruble to get on that transport system, one of the most modern on the planet. I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with going on the Sapsan from Moscow to St. Petersburg, you know, at 150 kilometers per hour in pristine conditions for a very cheap amount of money. I have no problem with seeing 3 cops walk in the street. Everywhere they go, there's 3 cops. I have no problem with that. Yeah. And I think most people in the West have no problem with that, but we've lost sight of the idea that the state here, for example, in Russia, the state takes its obligation to its citizens very seriously. In the West, we only take the obligation to the individual very seriously. It doesn't matter about society. So it doesn't matter if there's a tent city full of fentanyl addicts living under a bridge in LA. What the state will do is mobilize to defend the right of one guy to become a woman. Okay, he's on a Tuesday, he's a lady. On a Wednesday, he wants to be a guy. The state will mobilize huge resources to defend the right to do that, while ignoring the reality that the whole shit show is falling apart for average Joe, who has no interest in that type of stuff. I think Russia has it right in that respect. And, you know, I mean, you need to come and live the experience here. And some of my friends have done it, and they've come and they've said, they've left and they've said, what a massive propaganda operation has been deployed against us in the West to make places like Russia and China, to a great extent,